There exist narratives that refuse to fade into oblivion, stories that grip existence with such ferocious determination that they outlast empires, legislation, and even those who attempted to silence them forever. When the final slave vessel crossed the Atlantic Ocean in 1860 and reached American shores, it carried far more than its human cargo. Concealed within its hold was a secret so perilous that influential men would dedicate decades to its erasure. Yet one man retained every fragment of memory. His identity was Cudjo Lewis, and for half a century following slavery's abolition, he maintained his silence, not because recollection had abandoned him, but because certain truths bear such overwhelming weight that speaking them aloud becomes impossible until precisely the right moment emerges. This is the account of the final witness, the ultimate survivor of a transgression that powerful forces intended to vanish into history's shadows. A transgression involving prosperous merchants, corrupted officials, and a conspiracy extending to Alabama society's uppermost echelons. What Cudjo witnessed, what he endured, and what he ultimately disclosed would fundamentally shake everything America wished to believe about itself. Yet the question haunting him until his final breath remained devastatingly simple. If he revealed the truth, would anyone accept his testimony? Or more terrifyingly, would they ensure his voice fell permanently silent? The Clotilda slipped into Mobile Bay beneath darkness's protective cover on a humid July evening in 1860. Captain William Foster understood precisely the gravity of his actions. The international slave trade had been prohibited in the United States for 52 years. Any vessel discovered importing enslaved Africans would face immediate seizure, its cargo liberated, its crew executed by hanging. Nevertheless, Timothy Meagher, among Mobile's wealthiest shipbuilders, had initiated a wager born from whiskey and arrogance. During a dinner gathering months earlier, Meagher had engaged in heated debate with Northern visitors regarding states' rights and federal authority. The conversation intensified as Northerners maintained that the slave trade represented a barbaric relic, that civilized nations had progressed beyond such practices. Meagher, crimson, faced and enraged, slammed his fist against the table with explosive force. He declared he would deliver a shipload of Africans directly into Mobile Bay, and not a single federal marshal would dare touch him. He would demonstrate that Southern power remained absolute, that their federal regulations amounted to nothing beyond worthless paper and hollow threats. The room descended into uncomfortable silence. Some guests laughed nervously, assuming the bourbon had loosened his tongue excessively. But Timothy Meagher never articulated idle threats. He had constructed his fortune through calculated risks and unwavering confidence in his own invincibility. His brother James leaned forward, eyes gleaming with calculated interest, inquiring quietly about the venture's cost. Within 7 days, the conspiracy had crystallized. Timothy and James Meagher, alongside Burns Meagher and several other wealthy planters, assembled $35,000, an astronomical sum in 1860. They engaged Captain William Foster, an accomplished sailor with a reputation for discretion and willingness to manipulate legal boundaries for appropriate compensation. The Clotilda underwent preparation for the voyage, its hold modified to accommodate human cargo, its documentation falsified to indicate legitimate Caribbean trading operations. Foster departed Mobile in March 1860, crossing the Atlantic with 12 carefully selected crew members chosen for unwavering loyalty and guaranteed silence. The journey to West Africa consumed 6 weeks. Upon arrival at Ouida Port in the Kingdom of Dahomey, Foster established contact with local slave traders serving King Gliel. The Dahomey Kingdom represented one of West Africa's most formidable states, and King Gliel maintained dominance through relentless warfare against neighboring kingdoms. Prisoners of war constituted Dahome's most valuable export, and the king's warriors possessed legendary reputations for brutality and efficiency. Foster remained unconcerned with politics or historical context. His sole objective involved filling his ship's hold and returning to Mobile before federal authorities detected the operation. 110 people were purchased for $9,000 in gold. They originated from various ethnic groups, including Yoruba, Fon, and others captured during village raids throughout the region. Among them stood a young man named Oluwale Kasola, barely 19 years old, who would later become known as Cudjo Lewis. Cudjo's village of Bant had been prosperous and peaceful. His father commanded respect as a community member who mediated disputes and counseled younger men on farming and family matters. Cudjo had been training to follow his father's path, absorbing traditions and responsibilities that would eventually become his inheritance. He possessed sisters and brothers, aunts and uncles, a family network extending through the village like subterranean root systems. The morning of the raid, Cudjo had been laboring in the fields alongside his father and older brother. They heard drums first, not familiar celebration or ceremony rhythms, but urgent, frantic beats signifying only one thing: imminent danger. By the time they reached the village, smoke already rose from burning dwellings. The Dahomey warriors had struck at dawn when most people were still awakening, when defenses stood at their weakest point. Cudjo's father pushed him toward the forest, shouting for him to run, hide, survive. But Cudjo hesitated, glancing back toward his mother and sisters. That momentary hesitation cost him everything. A warrior seized him, struck him across the head with a machete's flat side, and he plunged into darkness. When consciousness returned, he found himself chained by the neck to a line of fellow captives. His head throbbed with agonizing pain and dried blood covered his face. He called out desperately for his family, but silence answered. The warriors forced them to march for 6 days, stopping only briefly for water and minimal food. Those unable to maintain pace received beatings. Those who collapsed were abandoned to die. At the coast, Cudjo saw the ocean for his life's first time. It stretched endlessly, a vast water expanse seemingly swallowing the sky, and anchored in the harbor stood the Clotulda, a vessel that would transport him away from everything he had ever known or loved. The Middle Passage consumed 45 days. 110 people were compressed into a hold designed for cargo, not human beings. They were chained in rows, unable to stand, barely able to shift position. The air grew thick with the stench of sweat, vomit, and human waste. Disease spread rapidly in the cramped, filthy conditions. Several people perished during the voyage, their bodies thrown overboard without ceremony or acknowledgement. Cudjo would never speak in detail about those weeks. When questioned later in life, he would shake his head and state only that it was a terrible time, that he preferred not to remember. But the scars marking his wrists and ankles told partial testimony. The nightmares waking him screaming for decades afterward told another portion. Some experiences proved too traumatic for verbal expression, too painful to revisit even in memory's sanctuary. When the Clotulda finally reached American waters in early July 1860, Captain Foster confronted a critical problem. Federal authorities in Mobile had heard rumors about Timothy Meagher's boast. Revenue cutters were patrolling the bay and customs officials maintained high alert. Foster couldn't simply sail into port and discharge his illegal cargo. He required a strategy. Foster anchored the Clotulda in a remote Mobile Bay section, distant from main shipping channels. Beneath darkness's cover, he transferred the captives to a riverboat owned by Burns Meagher. The operation required hours, with terrified, confused people being moved from one vessel to another, while armed men shouted orders in a language they couldn't comprehend. Once the transfer completed, Foster made a decision that would conceal his crime's evidence for more than a century and a half. He ordered the Clotilde stripped of anything valuable, then set ablaze. As flames consumed the ship, Foster and his crew observed from the riverboat. When the fire had completed its work, they towed the burning hulk into a remote bayou and allowed it to sink into dark water. The physical evidence of the crime vanished beneath the surface, leaving only human witnesses. Witnesses who spoke no English and possessed no legal standing in American society. The captives were transported up river to a swampy, isolated area north of Mobile. There, hidden in dense canebrakes and cypress swamps, they were kept in makeshift camps while the Meagher brothers decided how to distribute their illegal property. For weeks, the Africans existed in a state of terrified confusion. They didn't know their location, didn't understand unfolding events, and had no method to communicate with their captors beyond gestures and desperate pantomime attempts. Timothy Meagher visited the camp several times, walking among the captives like a farmer inspecting livestock. He pointed at individuals, making ledger notations, dividing them among his family and business associates. Cudjo and approximately 30 others were assigned to work on the Meagher plantation. They received new names, simple, easily pronounceable names that white overseers could manage. Oluel Kasola became Cudjo, a name carrying no meaning to him, bearing none of the history and identity his true name represented. The Africans were issued rough clothing, shown to crude cabins, and put to work. But unlike enslaved people born in America who had been conditioned from birth to accept their bondage, the Clotilde survivors remembered freedom. They remembered their authentic names, their languages, their families, their villages. They had been complete people with full lives, and those memories rendered them dangerous. The Meagher brothers comprehended this danger. They kept the new arrivals separated from other enslaved workers whenever possible. They instructed overseers to punish any attempts at teaching the Africans English beyond the bare minimum required for work. They spread rumors throughout Mobile that these were enslaved people purchased legally from Georgia and South Carolina plantations, brought to Alabama before the war made such transactions impossible. And they waited for the scandal to fade, for people to cease asking questions, for federal authorities to abandon their investigation. The Meaghers felt confident that their wealth and political connections would provide protection. They were pillars of Mobile society, respected businessmen, community leaders, who would believe the word of illiterate Africans against theirs. But history, as it often does, had alternative plans. Within 1 year of the Clotilde's arrival, America's political situation exploded. South Carolina seceded from the Union in December 1860. By February 1861, 6 additional Southern states had followed, including Alabama. The Confederate States of America was formed, and by April, the nation was at war. Timothy Meagher threw himself into the Confederate cause with identical arrogant confidence he displayed making his wager. He believed the South would win quickly, that Northern industrial power couldn't match Southern fighting spirit and British support. He converted his shipyards to produce vessels for the Confederate Navy. He invested heavily in Confederate bonds. He sent his sons to fight in the army, certain they would return as heroes of a victorious new nation. For 4 years, war raged. Cudjo and the other Clotilde survivors worked the Meagher plantation, growing food for the Confederate war effort, maintaining the property while white men departed to fight. They heard rumors of Union victories, of enslaved people escaping to freedom behind Northern lines, of a proclamation declaring them free. But in rural Alabama, distant from battlefields, those rumors seemed like impossible dreams. Then in April 1865, everything transformed. Union troops occupied Mobile. The Confederacy collapsed, And suddenly, impossibly, Cudjo Lewis and the other Clotilda survivors were told they were free. But what did freedom signify for someone who spoke limited English, possessed no money, no land, no family in America, and was living proof of a federal crime committed by men who still wielded enormous power in Alabama? That question would define the remainder of Cudjo's life, and the answer would prove far more complicated and perilous than anyone could have imagined. Freedom arrived for Cudjo Lewis not with celebration, but with confusion and fear. When Union soldiers reached the Meagher plantation in April 1865, they gathered all the enslaved people and read from a document declaring them free. The words meant little to Cudjo, who still struggled with English. But the overseer's reactions, the shock, the anger, the barely concealed rage, told him that something fundamental had shifted. The Union officer in charge, a young lieutenant from Massachusetts, attempted to explain their options. They could stay and work for wages. They could leave and seek employment elsewhere. They could try to return to their homes, though he admitted that for those born in Africa, such a journey was impossible. The officer meant well, but his words revealed a profound misunderstanding of their situation. What did wages mean to people who had never handled money? Where could they go when they knew nothing of American geography? How could they return to villages that might no longer exist, to families who might be dead or scattered? Timothy Meagher, meanwhile, was facing his own crisis. The Confederacy had lost. His investments in Confederate bonds were worthless. His shipyards had been damaged during the Union occupation. His sons had returned from war, one missing an arm, another suffering from what would later be called shell shock. The world he had known, the system that had made him wealthy and powerful, was collapsing around him. But Meagher was a survivor. He understood that the war might be over, but the struggle for power in the South was just beginning, and he recognized that the Clotilda survivors represented both a threat and an opportunity. The threat was obvious. They were living evidence of a federal crime. If federal prosecutors decided to make an example of someone, if they wanted to show that the law applied even to wealthy white Southerners, the Clotilda case would be perfect. The crime was clear, the evidence undeniable, and the penalty execution would send a powerful message. Meagher knew that in the chaotic early days of Reconstruction, with federal troops occupying the South and radical Republicans pushing for harsh punishment of Confederate leaders, he was vulnerable. But Meagher also saw an opportunity. The Africans needed land, needed a place to build their lives, and Meagher owned thousands of acres of worthless swampland along the Mobile River, land that was too wet for farming, too remote for development, too mosquito-infested for anyone to want. If he could convince the Africans to settle there, he could accomplish several goals at once. Keep them close where he could monitor them, bind them to him through debt, and create the appearance of benevolence that might protect him from prosecution. Within weeks of the war's end, Meagher approached the Clotilda survivors with a proposal. He would sell them parcels of land, 2 acres per family, at what he claimed was a fair price. They could pay over time, working for wages on his remaining properties or in his shipyards, with their earnings going toward the land debt. To people who had nothing, who desperately wanted to recreate some version of the communities they'd lost, it seemed like a miracle. Cudjo was among those who accepted. He was 24 years old, strong and healthy, and determined to build a life in this strange new country. He had met a woman named Abolition, another Clotilda survivor who had been renamed Seeley by her enslavers. She was from a different village, spoke a different dialect, but they shared the bond of the Middle Passage and the desperate need to create family in a place where they had none. Together, Cudjo and Abolition began to build. They cleared land, cutting through thick underbrush and draining standing water. They built a small cabin using techniques Cudjo remembered from Bant, adapted to the materials available in Alabama. They planted a garden with vegetables and herbs, some familiar from Africa, others new, and they joined with other Clotulda survivors to create a community. The settlement that would become known as Africatown took shape slowly over the next several years. About 30 families of Clotulda survivors clustered together along the Mobile River, their homes arranged in patterns that echoed African village layouts. They spoke their native languages, Yoruba primarily, but also Fon and others, creating a linguistic island in the American South. They practiced what they could remember of their traditions, adapted what they had to forget, and created something new, a hybrid culture that was neither fully African nor fully American. But the land deal that had seemed like salvation revealed itself to be another form of bondage. The prices Meher charged were inflated far beyond the land's actual value. The interest rates were usurious, and the wages he paid for work were barely enough to cover basic necessities, let alone make significant payments on the debt. Cudjo and the others found themselves trapped in a cycle that would take decades to escape, working constantly, earning little, always owing more. And beneath the economic exploitation lay a more insidious form of control, fear. Timothy Meher and his brothers began a quiet but relentless campaign to ensure the Clotulda survivors stayed silent about the ship and the circumstances of their arrival in America. The message was delivered through intermediaries, overseers, foremen, white workers who had connections to the Meher family. It was never explicit, never written down, but it was unmistakable. Speaking about the Clotulda would bring trouble. The threat took many forms. Sometimes it was economic. Mr. Meher might have to call in those land debts if people start spreading stories. Sometimes it was legal. Federal authorities might decide to deport anyone who was brought here illegally. Sometimes it was more direct. Accidents happen to people who don't know when to keep their mouth shut. Cudjo understood the game being played. He had seen how power worked in Dahomey, where King Glial maintained control through a combination of rewards and threats. The Mehers were using identical tactics. They gave just enough land, wages, the appearance of freedom to make people hesitant to risk losing it. And they created just enough fear to keep people from speaking out. The 1870s brought new challenges and new dangers. Reconstruction was in full swing, and for a brief moment, it seemed like real change might be possible. Black men could vote. Black politicians were elected to local and state offices. Schools were opened for black children. Federal troops enforced the new laws protecting black citizens from violence and intimidation. Cudjo watched these developments with cautious hope. He learned to read and write, attending classes taught by Northern missionaries who had come south to educate the formerly enslaved. He registered to vote, casting his ballot in elections for the first time in his life. He attended political meetings where black and white Republicans discussed plans for rebuilding the South on principles of equality and justice. But he also saw the backlash. White supremacist groups, the Ku Klux Klan, the White League, the Red Shirts, launched campaigns of terror against black communities. They burned schools and churches. They murdered black politicians and voters. They attacked anyone, black or white, who supported Reconstruction policies. The violence was systematic, organized, and designed to send a clear message. Black political participation would not be tolerated. In 1874, Cudjo witnessed an event that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A black man named Samuel Johnson, who had been elected to the Mobile City Council, was found dead on the road between Africatown and Mobile. The official story was that he'd been killed by robbers, but everyone knew the truth. Johnson had been murdered because he'd spoken out against the Meher family's business practices, including their exploitation of black workers. No one was arrested. No investigation was conducted. The message was clear. Even elected officials weren't safe if they challenged white power. Cudjo attended Johnson's funeral, standing in the back of the church, listening to the preacher talk about martyrdom and justice. But what Cudjo heard beneath the words was a warning. This could happen to anyone who speaks too loudly. By 1877, Reconstruction was effectively over. Federal troops withdrew from the South. White supremacist governments reclaimed power throughout the region. The brief window of black political participation slammed shut. New laws, the Black Codes, later replaced by Jim Crow legislation, stripped away voting rights, segregated public spaces, and created a system of legal discrimination that would last for nearly a century. The Meagher family, far from being prosecuted for their crime, grew even wealthier and more powerful. Timothy Meagher expanded his business interests, investing in railroads, lumber mills, and real estate. He became a respected figure in Mobile society, his past conveniently forgotten by white citizens who benefited from his economic influence. When he died in 1892, his obituary in the Mobile Register praised him as a pioneer businessman and pillar of the community. The Clotilda was not mentioned. Cudjo and Abolition, meanwhile, were raising a family. Their first child, Alec, was born in 1866. James followed in 1868, then Cudjo Jr. in 1870, Polly in 1872, David in 1875, and finally Sally in 1878. 6 children born free in America who would never know the horrors their parents had endured, but would inherit the consequences. Cudjo worked constantly to provide for his family. He labored on the docks, loading and unloading ships. He worked in lumber mills, cutting timber from the forests around Mobile. He did odd jobs for white families, repairing fences, building sheds, whatever would earn a few dollars. Abolition took in laundry, washed clothes for white families, and sold vegetables from their garden. Together, they slowly, painfully paid down the debt on their land. But Cudjo also made time to teach his children about their heritage. In the evenings after work, he would gather them around and tell stories about Bant. He taught them words in Yoruba, though he knew they would never be fluent. He explained the traditions of his people, the values that had guided his life before the Clotilda. He wanted them to know where they came from, even if he couldn't tell them the full truth of how they'd arrived in America. The children grew up straddling 2 worlds. At home, they heard African languages and stories. In the wider world, they faced the harsh realities of being black in Jim Crow Alabama. They attended segregated schools with hand-me-down textbooks and underpaid teachers. They learned to navigate the complex rules of racial etiquette. Never look a white person directly in the eye. Always step off the sidewalk when a white person approaches. Never question or challenge white authority. Cudjo watched his children navigate these dangers with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. They were adapting, surviving, finding ways to live in a hostile world. But he also saw how the system was crushing their spirits, limiting their possibilities, teaching them to accept injustice as normal. Then tragedy struck and struck again, and kept striking until Cudjo felt like he was being punished by forces beyond his understanding. In 1893, their daughter Sally fell ill with a fever. She was only 15 years old, bright and beautiful with her mother's smile and her father's determination. Cudjo and Abolition tried everything: home remedies, prayers, a white doctor who charged them a week's wages for a brief examination. Nothing worked. Sally died on a hot August night, her body burning with fever, her parents helpless beside her bed. The grief nearly destroyed them. Abolition stopped speaking for weeks, moving through the house like a ghost. Cudjo threw himself into work, laboring until exhaustion made thought impossible. 3 years later, in 1896, their son David was killed. The circumstances were murky, the details contradictory, but the outcome was brutally clear. David had been working at a sawmill when he got into an argument with a white coworker. The argument escalated. The white man struck David. David, young and angry and tired of swallowing insults, struck back. That night, David didn't come home. Cudjo went looking for him, searching the roads between the sawmill and Africa Town, calling his son's name into the darkness. He found David's body at dawn, lying in a ditch beside the road. He had been beaten to death. Cudjo carried his son's body home, walking the 3 miles with David's weight in his arms. Neighbors came out of their houses, saw what had happened, and wept. Everyone knew what this meant. Everyone understood that there would be no justice, no investigation, no consequences for the murderers. Cudjo wanted to go to the sheriff, wanted to demand that someone be held accountable. But the elders of Africa Town stopped him. "You go to the sheriff," they said, "and they'll find a reason to arrest you. They'll say David started it, say he attacked a white man, say you're causing trouble. You'll end up dead or in prison, and Abiel will lose her husband and her son." So Cudjo buried David next to Sally, carved another wooden cross, and swallowed his rage. But something broke inside him that day. He had survived the Middle Passage, survived slavery, survived 50 years of dangerous freedom. But watching his children die, unable to protect them, unable to seek justice, that was a different kind of death. The worst blow came in 1902. Cudjo Jr., their 3rd child and namesake, was working for the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. He was a brakeman, a dangerous job that required him to couple and uncouple train cars, often while they were moving. On a cold February morning, something went wrong. Cudjo Jr. was crushed between 2 cars. The railroad claimed it was his fault, said he'd been careless, said he'd violated safety procedures. They denied any compensation to the family. When Cudjo Sr. tried to pursue the matter, the railroad's lawyers threatened to sue him for defamation and harassment. The message was clear: accept the loss and move on, or lose everything. Cudjo was 61 years old. He had now buried 3 of his 6 children. Abiel's health was failing, her spirit broken by repeated grief. And Cudjo found himself facing a question that had haunted him since the day the Clotilde landed in Mobile Bay. What was the point of survival if everything you built could be taken away? But even in his darkest moments, Cudjo held on to something: memory. He remembered Bant, remembered his father's teachings, remembered the values that had guided his people for generations. And he realized that if he died without speaking, if he let the Mehers succeed in burying the truth, then his children's deaths would be meaningless. The Clotilde would be forgotten, the crime erased, and the next generation would never know what had been done to them. So Cudjo made a decision. He would wait for the right moment, the right person, the right opportunity. And when it came, he would tell the truth, all of it, no matter the consequences. He just had to survive long enough to find someone who would listen. The early years of the 20th century brought both change and continuity to Africa Town. The community had grown, with children and grandchildren of the original Clotilde survivors creating a vibrant, tight-knit neighborhood. They had built churches, established mutual aid societies, and created institutions that served their needs in a segregated society. But they also faced increasing pressure from industrial development spreading along the Mobile River. Factories and shipyards encroached on Africa Town's borders. The air grew thick with smoke and chemical smells. The river, once a source of fish and fresh water, became polluted with industrial waste. White-owned businesses bought up land around the community, squeezing it into an ever smaller area. Cudjo watched these developments with weary recognition. He was in his 60s now, his body worn from decades of hard labor. His wife Abiel's health continued to decline. She suffered from what doctors called melancholia, what we would now recognize as severe depression brought on by repeated trauma and loss. She spent much of her time sitting in their small house, staring out the window, occasionally speaking in Yoruba to people who weren't there. Cudjo cared for her as best he could, but he also had to keep working. The debt on their land was finally paid off, but they still needed money for food, medicine, and basic necessities. In 1908, Abiel died. She was 67 years old, and she had spent 43 years in America without ever seeing her homeland again. Cudjo buried her next to their children in the small cemetery that now held so many of Africatown's dead. He carved her headstone himself, writing her name in both English and Yoruba. Abiel Seeley, wife and mother, gone home. After Abiel's death, Cudjo lived alone. His surviving children, Alec, James, and Polly, had families of their own and lived nearby, but Cudjo preferred solitude. He spent his days tending his garden, repairing his house, and sitting on his porch, watching the world change around him. In 1914, something unexpected happened. A young black woman named Emma Langdon Roch came to Africatown. She was a writer and historian interested in documenting the stories of formerly enslaved people before they were lost forever. She had heard rumors about the Clotilda and wanted to know if they were true. Cudjo agreed to speak with her, though he was cautious. He told her about his life in Bant, about the raid and the Middle Passage, about the years of slavery and the complicated decades of freedom. But when she asked specific questions about the Clotilda, who had brought them, how they had arrived, what had happened to the ship, Cudjo became evasive. "It was a long time ago," he said. "My memory is not so good anymore." Roch was persistent. She interviewed other Africatown residents, pieced together fragments of the story, and eventually published a book in 1914 called Historic Sketches of the South. In it, she included a chapter about the Clotilda and its survivors. It was the first time the story appeared in print, and it created a small stir locally. The Meher family's response was swift and coordinated. They issued statements calling the book sensationalized fiction and questioning Roch's sources. They pointed out inconsistencies in the accounts. Different people remembered different details. Dates didn't always match. Some elements seemed exaggerated. They suggested that Roch had been taken in by tall tales and folklore, that she had confused legend with fact. The campaign was effective. Newspapers in Mobile published articles questioning the book's accuracy. Historians dismissed it as unreliable, and within a few years, Historic Sketches of the South was largely forgotten, relegated to the category of interesting but unverified local lore. Cudjo read about the controversy with a mixture of frustration and resignation. He had told Roch the truth, or at least part of it, but he had also held back, afraid of what might happen if he spoke too openly. And now the Mehers had successfully discredited the story, making it seem like fantasy rather than documented fact. But Cudjo also noticed something interesting. Despite the Mehers' efforts to discredit the book, people kept asking questions. Journalists would occasionally come to Africatown looking for the old African man who had supposedly been brought on the last slave ship. Historians wrote letters asking for interviews. Even some white residents of Mobile expressed curiosity about the story. The questions made Cudjo think. Maybe the time wasn't right yet, but maybe it would come. Maybe there would be someone who would listen, really listen, and have the skill and credibility to tell the story in a way that couldn't be dismissed or discredited. He just had to stay alive long enough to find that person. The years passed slowly. World War I came and went, barely touching Africatown except for the young men who went to fight and sometimes didn't come back. The 1920s brought economic prosperity to some parts of America, but not to black communities in the South. Africatown remained poor, isolated, and increasingly surrounded by industrial development that brought pollution but no jobs for local residents. Cudjo was in his 80s now, moving slowly, his vision failing, his hearing diminished. But his mind remained sharp, and his memory was perfect. He could still recall every detail of Bant, could still hear his father's voice, could still feel the weight of chains on his wrists during the Middle Passage. The memories hadn't faded. If anything, they had become more vivid as other aspects of his life receded. Then, in the spring of 1927, a woman named Zora Neale Hurston came to Africatown. Hurston was unlike anyone Cudjo had ever met. She was a young black woman educated at Barnard College in New York. studying anthropology under the famous Franz Boas. She was researching African American folklore and culture, traveling through the South with a notebook, a camera, and an insatiable curiosity. She had heard about Africatown from other researchers, and she was determined to document the stories of the Clotholda's survivors before they were lost forever. When Hurston knocked on Cudjo's door, he was initially suspicious. He'd spoken to journalists and researchers before, and the experience had rarely been positive. They usually wanted exotic stories about Africa, wanted to hear about savage customs and primitive beliefs, wanted to treat him like a curiosity rather than a person. But Hurston was different from the first moment she spoke. "Mr. Lewis," she said, "I'm here to listen to your story. Not the story white people want to hear, but your story in your own words, told the way you want to tell it. I'm here to write it down exactly as you say it, to preserve your voice and your truth. And I promise you that I will do everything in my power to make sure the world hears what you have to say." Cudjo looked at her for a long moment, studying her face, trying to gauge her sincerity. He had been waiting for this moment for more than 60 years, waiting for someone he could trust with the full truth. Was this young woman the one? If you found this story as powerful as I did, please subscribe to my channel so you never miss stories like these that deserve to be remembered. Your support helps keep these voices alive.